React Context is a powerful feature that allows us to share data between multiple components without having to pass prop down the component tree. In version 16.3, React officially released its stable API for using context. It is especially useful for sharing global app setting, user authentication, and other data that needs to be accessed by multiple components. In today's video, we are going to discuss what is React Context, how to use it, and then we will implement a theme context. So without any further delay, let us get started. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this tutorial, I'm going to discuss everything you need to know about React Context in order to start using it. I'm going to start first with a presentation to discuss the theoretical part and show you the different way you can implement React Context. So, what is the problem that we are trying to solve using React Context? Before we start, I would highly recommend for you guys to watch my previous tutorial about render props, which I'm going to leave a link for it in the description of this video. So, what is the problem we are trying to solve with context? As you know, in React, we can only pass information downward using props. So if we have two sibling components that need the same state, then we have to lift that state to a common parent component and then use props to pass the state back to both sibling component, and by doing so both components can share the same data. Which means in our simple application, component 8 needs access to the data in component 9 and it cannot access it directly. So we have to lift the data to the common component, which is component 3, and from there we are going to pass down the data using props. So now while developing our application, we notice that the sibling of the parent components needs that data as well. Then once again we have to lift the state up to our parent component and pass it down through props. So if component C4 need access to the data again, it cannot access it directly. We have to lift the data or state to the common parent component between these components, and in our case it is the app component. And then we are going to use props to pass the state down to the components that require it. Honestly, this is not that bad. Passing down props a couple of layers isn't that bad. But then while continuing to develop the app, some other component far down in the tree of the application needs that same data and there is no common parent. Then we have to lift that state to the top component, which is usually the app component, and then begin the tedious process of passing down the props until it reaches that component. This is called prop drilling, which is very difficult to maintain your application, since it will involve a lot of repetition across multiple files. Some components wouldn't need that data at all, like component 1 and component 3, but they are being used as a tunnel to get the data to the components that actually needs it. This is the problem that context can solve. Context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. In simple terms, in order to solve the same problem of props drilling, what we will do is that we will choose a common parent for all these components. And this common parent component is going to be wrapped by what is called a provider. And then we will wrap all the components that needs the data in what is called a consumer. And then the provider and the consumer allow React to create a context tunnel that leads directly into whatever component is consuming the data. An example of this data could be a username, a token, a shopping cart, favorite list, global app setting, user authentication, and so on. Context not only allows us to pass data, but we can also pass a method that allows the consumer to modify the data, such as changing theme from dark to light or check the username. And this is very important, and we'll see why in the implementation of the theme context example in this tutorial. Although context should not be used in every circumstances, It is robust enough that it has become for a lot of people their state management tool of choice. Some developer has replaced the Redux implementation using only context. So in some circumstances, React context is all you need to accomplish your state management goal. And from my experience, I would recommend to use context in a small to medium application. And of course, you can use both React context and Redux state management together in the same application. Before we start coding our example, let us see how to create context. The first thing that we have to do is to create context using react.createContext. So when we use create context, we receive what is called a compound component, which means that context is an object and it has a couple of properties, which are component. So we will have provider and consumer in this object. So maybe you want, as in the case of this example, that the app component to have access to this context. Then we are going to wrap the app component with a provider. Please note that the provider is a component and context is the object that is holding that property. The context is going to work around a provider and a consumer. So what we are going to do is to wrap the component that we want to provide context to with a provider. And then any child component that will consume context will be wrapped by a consumer. So what we need to pass to our provider? There is a prop that we always have to pass to the provider, and that is called the value prop. And the value prop is simply enough the data that we have to save. The value could be something as simple as Boolean or a number or a string. This value prop is hard-coded, but we can also refactor our provider on its own component so that we can add state and method to it, which means we are going to create a new component in the context and we will render it instead of the provider. The provider does not make any sense without the consumer. The way consumer work is by using render prop that is going to be injected into the elements. Please again watch my previous tutorial about render props. As a quick recap, with render prop we can either provide a render property or a child element. The way consumer implements the children is by calling a function. So we need to provide a function, and when they call it, they are gonna call it with the context value that is hard-coded in the provider. So we are going to provide this function, and what this function is going to return is the element that needs to have access to the value. There are two ways to implement React context, either using React hook use context or without using React hook, and we are going to implement both. The app that we are going to implement is very simple. It is made up of 4 components, and we are going to create a theme context. So let us start implementing React next. Alright guys, now we are going to start building our application using React context. As we can see here, the application is very simple. It has an app component and 4 other components: header, main, content, and message. It is very simple for the sake of learning React context. Let us now head to Visual Studio Code and check our application. So here is our application. We have the app component, which is using here a state hook to create a theme. And we have the toggle theme here, which is responsible for changing the theme from light to dark and from dark to light. And it has 3 children components. We have the main and content, and we are using props to pass the theme value to this component. And also we are using prop to pass the toggle, which is responsible to change the theme to the header component. And in the content as well, we have a child component called message, and we are also passing the theme to this component using props as well. Okay, and here in this first way of implementing the React context, we are going to create a context and see how we can use it without using the React hook. In the next part, we are going to implement it using React hook. Let us now check the website to have more clear idea about what we are building. The website is very simple. We have here the app component, main, content, and message, and we have in the header the button toggle theme, which is responsible for changing the theme from dark to light. Alright guys, let us now head back to Visual Studio Code and start creating React context. Okay, so the first step that we have to do is to create the context. So let us create here an empty file and we call it theme context.js. Then we're going to say import React from React, and then we are going to create a constant called theme context is equal to React dot create context, and then we are going to say export default theme context. Okay, so when we use create context, we receive what is called a compound component, which means that context is an object and it has a couple of properties which are component. So we'll have a provider and consumer component. So theme context is made up of the following: theme context dot provider and theme context dot consumer. And since we want the app component to have access to this context, then we are going to wrap the app component with a provider, which is going to be theme context dot provider. So let us head up now to index.js and wrap the app component with our provider. But first we have to import our context. So if we click here and we say import theme context, and then here say theme context provider, and then like this. So we have wrapped now the app component with theme context provider. Now for any component that is a children or a child to the app component need access to the provider, we have to use the consumer. Alright, there is a prop that we always have to pass to the provider, and that is called the value prop. And the value of this one could be anything, and for this application I'm gonna just make the default value a string light. It could be a boolean, it could be a number, it could be a method, but for now I'm gonna pass a string. Now for any component now that need access to this value, we have to wrap that component with a consumer. So let us now test the message component. So if we go now to the message component, we can see it's using the theme, but it's using the props value that's coming from its parent component. So how can we access now the value that's coming from the provider? The first step is to import the theme context. So import theme context from there. So now, the way consumer work is by using render prop that's going to be injected into the element here. Again, I would highly recommend for you guys to watch my tutorial about render prop, where I put the link for that tutorial in the description of this video. So with our consumer, we are going to create a new instance of theme context.consumer. And this is going to be a component that is having an opening and closing tags. So let's create the instance. We'll have theme context.consumer, and we'll have the closing tag theme context.consumer. The way consumer work is by using render prop that's going to be injected into the element here. With render prop, we can either provide a render property. For example, here we'll say render equal, and then we put the value, or in our case we can use a child element. And the way consumer implements the children is by calling a function. So let us open curly braces here to go back to JavaScript. So we need to provide a function, and when we call it, we are gonna call it with the context value that's hard coded in the provider. I'm gonna call the value here theme. And what this function is going to return is the elements that needs to have access to the theme. So let us open the return here, and I'm going to move this element up to the function. Save, and we have no errors here, so this means everything is successful. Okay, so I moved the message element inside this function return, and now because it's inside a function that will be called with the value of the context, this means we have access for the value inside this component. So to test this, let us remove the props dot here, because we have the value here of the provider that we had coded it, and we can have access to it here. So if we go back to the index, we can see that the default value we put light. So the message theme should be light. To check it out, let's just check our website to make sure it is working as expected. And yes, we can see here the message theme is light. Let us now change just the value to dark and check out if it's gonna change here for the message component. So if we go back to the index here and we change this light to dark and save, let us check now. Yes, it is working. So we have now implemented the provider consumer pair, and we saw how to pass the values between the provider and consumer without using props. Let us now implement the same for all the remaining components. So if we go to the content here, again, we have to import first theme context, and then we have to create a new instance of the context consumer as the following .consumer, and it should be a component with opening and closing tag, and we are going to open the curly braces and call a function, and we are going to call the variable theme, and this function will return the elements that need access to this value, which is these elements. I'm going to move it up here and save, and since we call the property here value theme similar to what we have in the props, we can just simply remove the prop value here, and let us save and check our work if it is working. And yes, it is working. Let us now work on the main component. In the main component, we are going to do the same as well. We are going to say import theme context, and then here in the return we are going to create a new instance of the theme context.consumer, which is a component with an opening and closing tag, opening a curly braces to call a function with a theme value that returns the elements that need access to it. And sorry, I'm gonna move these to the return function and save. Again, no need for the props here. Save, check, and it is working, the main. Now for the app component, let's go to the app component. In the app component, we don't need these constant values, this state value anymore. So let us comment it here for the time being. Okay, it is broken now, but we'll see how to fix it now. Let us import theme context, and here we are going to create a new instance of theme context.consumer, opening closing cards, curly braces we have seen here, and we are going to move this element inside, and we are going to save. Now we don't need anymore to pass props down, because as we said, we don't have to pass the props values. We are using context, React context now, and we have access to it. And for the toggle method, I'm going to delete it for the time being. We will see now how we solve this issue now. Okay, let us now save and check our website to see if it is working fine. Yes, everything is fine. But now the toggle, it's not working. We cannot change the theme. All right, let us head now to Visual Studio Code and see why. So right now we hard coded the value of the theme in the provider, but we want to hook our toggle theme button. So we have to create a method, and as we know in React, when we have data that might change, we need to use state. But right now our provider is in a file that isn't even creating a component, and therefore it is going to be very hard to put a state anywhere because we don't have a component to put it inside. So we are going to refactor this to put the provider in its own component so that we can add state to it and the toggle theme method to it as well, and to hook our button. So let us go to the theme context file, and our goal here is to create a component that will render in place of the provider. So first we have to create a component. So here we have to create a component, and we are going to call it theme context provider. And this is the component that we are going to use to replace the theme context.provider. And this new component is going to return theme context.provider. So we'll have here return theme context.provider, which is having an opening and a closing tag, as we had before, so that we can surround our app component with our new theme context provider. And we have to make sure that it will render the children component by using the props.children. So here we'll say props.children. And as you remember, every provider has a required prop called value. And let us hardcode the value here as before. So we'll say here value is equal, and we'll hardcode it to light as before. Now we have a problem. Right now we are exporting theme context, the ones that came from create context. But we want to export the new component as well, so that we can use it somewhere else, and we cannot export it only the new component. We also need to export the consumer as well. So instead of default exporting our theme context here, we are going to export the provider and consumer as a name export. So here we are going to export theme context provider, okay, and our consumer. So we have to object destructuring theme context into provider and consumer. Remember, as we said before, theme context, the one that we created before, is an object that has two components, and provider and consumer. And by typing it this way, we destructure that object into a provider and consumer. But something else is broken here. We don't have anymore the object theme context, so what we have to do is just delete this value here. Yeah. And that's it. So let us save, and we see that our app is broken. So let us fix the rest of the app. So let's go first to the index. So instead of default importing the theme context here, we need the provider only here. So we'll name import the provider. And then here, we are going to remove theme.context. And since the value is being handled here inside the new component, we don't need anymore to pass the value here. Of course, we can use it here, and then we have to use the props to change the values. But to better organize our work, we have to make sure everything is being handled inside the theme context. So let us delete this one here and save. We see that we still have errors here. So let us go to the app component here. We don't have access anymore to theme context. We are going to import here the consumer. And here we are going to delete the theme context.consumer as well. Let us save, less error. Let's go to the main component as well. Here we are going to import the consumer, and the same thing here, we have to delete the theme context and save. And then in content here, again, we are going to import only the consumer. We don't have the access to this object anymore. Save. Yeah, and here we don't need the props value as well. Okay, let me delete this one. Yeah, and delete the whole thing here. Okay, save. And also in the message component, we only have access to consumer. So let us delete this and this as well. And save. And I did a mistake here. We should have theme context provider. Theme context provider. Let us save. Theme context provider, since here in theme context we are exporting theme context provider, not only the provider. So, and I'm still having here a warning in app.js. We no longer need the use state because we are not using any state here. And everything is clear now. It is successful. Let us now check our application and to see if it is working. And yes, it is working. So still we don't have access to the method here, which we are going to do next. So let us now head to Visual Studio Code and configure state value and toggle method inside the theme context. So since now our provider has its own component, we can add state values here and method and pass it to the consumer. To save time in app.js, I'm going to copy this code here to the theme context, and I'm going to uncomment this, and I'm going to import use state from React, use state. And then here, instead of hard coding the value to a string, as I said before, we can either pass a string, a boolean, an integer, or we can pass an object. So here I'm going to pass an object. And the object, it could be theme, which is theme, and the toggle theme, which is toggle theme. Alright, so now we are passing the theme, and the default value is light, and the toggle theme method. But we have also here now a small change that we have to do. Since we are passing an object here, our application is going to be broken. Let us start with first app.js. Now we are having an object, not a single value here. So let me just rename this to context, okay, which is the value that I'm receiving from the provider. And then here I'm gonna type context.theme. Alright, let us save and let's go to content as well. I'm gonna change this to context. And then here I'm going to change to context theme. And in the header, yeah, in the header here, I have to import the consumer. Import consumer from theme context. And then here I'm going to create an instance from consumer. And in curly braces, I'm receiving the context. And I'm returning the elements that need access to it. So I'm going to move the header up to the returned value here. And on click, I'm going to here say context dot toggle, and no need for this as anymore. Let us save. Also in the main here, I'm going to have context instead of theme. And here I'm gonna name it to context.theme. Let us save. And where else? In message. In message here, you can change this to context. And then context.theme. Let us save here. Okay. Let us check now our website to see if its functionality is working as expected. So here, if I click toggle theme, yeah, it's working. It's changing the theme to light and then to dark. So this means that we have implemented the React context. I know it's a little bit hard, but feel free to repeat this part of the video again more than one time in order to observe the information. We implemented React context now without using the React hook use context. And we are going to implement now the same thing using the React context hook in the next part. And you'll see it will be much easier. I intentionally implemented it right here without using use context in order to explain how the provider and consumer work together so that it will be easier when we are using the hook. So let us start now implementing React context using the React hook use context. Alright guys, now we are going to implement React context using React hook use context, which will make our life much easier. The first step is to import the hook from React. So here we are going to say import use context. Okay. And to recap, here in the message component, the message is receiving a consumer from our context and then rendering the consumer, which uses render prop pattern by providing a child as a function. And it will give you the value of the context that you put in there. And then we can use that context to display the theme or to toggle the theme as in the header component. Okay, so here at the top in this function, we have to define our context. Context equal use context. This context is the object that we define here. Remember, here we are passing the value as an object theme and toggle theme. So here in the message, we are going to receive it here. But use context hook require to have access to the entire theme context, to the entire context. And we are exporting here only the theme context provider and consumer. So what we have to do here is to export our entire context. So we have to do some modification here. So instead of destructuring our context here, I'm going to change it back to what it was. So we'll have here constant theme context. And then here I'm gonna export it. And I have to do one change here as well. Theme context. Alright, so this is all the changes that I have to do here in the theme context. So let us go back now to the message. So instead of importing the consumer, now I'm going to import the entire context and then I will be able to use it here. Alright, so now context is having an access to the theme and the toggle method. So now the beauty of using React hook use context is that we no longer need to create an instance of our consumer so that we can get rid of the following. And since before we were using context, we don't have to change this value here as well. But as we can see here, the other components are broken. So let us do the same for the other. Let us start with the app.js. So here we are going to import theme context, and then we are going to create constant context is equal to use context, which is coming from theme context. And then we can get rid of the following and save. Also in the content as well, we have here theme context. And then we are going to create our object context, which is equal to use context, which have access to entire consumer, our entire context. And let us get rid of the following, and here as well, save. Same in the header, we are going to import theme context, and then we'll create our object context, which is equal to use context, and we can get rid of the following. Save. One more place is in the main. So here we are going to have theme context, constant context is equal to use context, theme context, and we can delete the following and save. We have no more errors, so let us now check our website to see if it's still working, and we will recap what we have done. So this is our website. If we toggle, it's working fine using the use context. As you can see, this is amazing. This means that we don't have to worry about providing the consumer and using the render prop pattern with the children function or any of that. We can simply in one line grab the context value by using the context hook. Hopefully you can start to see how hooks can dramatically change our code base. And please feel free to download the project from the link in the description of this video and test everything out and rewatch the tutorial and follow along. Final thing I want to mention is when not to use React context. First of all, don't use context just to avoid prop drilling a layer down or two. It is important to think of context as a tool that is handling states that is needed by a large portion of your application. So for a layer or two, it is easier to pass props drilling solution. According to React documentation, it suggests to use component composition to avoid passing information down multiple levels through props. Second, you should not use context for states that should be kept locally, for example, forms. Again, context is not a replacement of a state in React. So if you are creating a form and you need to keep state of the inputs that the user is typing, do not do that in context. If that information is not needed by other component, then there is no need to put it in the context. Third, you have to wrap the provider around the lowest common parent in the tree for the data that needs it. By doing so, it will help you to avoid some unnecessary rendering. Lastly, if you are going to pass an object as a value in a provider, you have to watch for performance issue and you refactor your code if necessary. So that's it guys for this tutorial. If you have any question or feedback, please leave them down below. And don't forget to subscribe in order to learn more about advanced features in React. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.